Welcome back, guys. We just had a look at Magnus's game against Firouzja from Norway Chess, round 2. That was a classical game in the Queen's Gambit. This is the tiebreaker between the players. And again, we got a Queen's Gambit on the board. C4, E6. Same move order as in the classical game. That's interesting to see. Alireza trusts his prepared opening. D5. CD, ED, and Bishop G5. So far so good. We had a look at this in the previous video. C6, E3, H6. Retreating with the Bishop E7, and now Queen C2 from Magnus. Castles and a Knight F3. Big change from the classical game. Magnus opts for a different setup with white instead of the Bishop D3, Knight E2 setup he chose in the previous game. Rook E8, Bishop D3, and now a very nice move. Just don't forget this kind of trick in the Queen's Gambit with black. Very nice liberating maneuver from Alireza, exchanging off the dark squared bishops as black's position is slightly cramped. You want to exchange at least a couple of pieces. In the Queen's Gambit, there's no easy break with the pawns for black available in the center, so very often you have to rely on playing with your pieces. And this is what Alireza does in this game. Knight E4, you could of course take immediately on E4, but as we will see, there's no tactic here that allows you to win a pawn. There are several problems with this. Of course, you could also, instead of taking on E4, the best move is of course Bishop H4 with black. And if you go for this, for example, and play something like Bishop D3, suddenly you might end up in some trouble thanks to the pin from the rook on E8. If you do take with the E pawn, DE, then Queen takes E4, Bishop takes H4, and now the problem for black is Queen H4 is a available resource for white, which nets him a pawn. Magnus chose to play Bishop takes E7, keeping at least some pieces on the board after this operation, not exchanging queens, as we saw was an alternative in the other variation. DE4, Knight D2, and now F5 from Alireza. Okay, so Magnus could go for some quiet play with short castle, but instead he shows great ambition and decides to play long castle in this position. Knight D7 from Alireza. Now, of course, we see that black's tactic in this game will be to attack on the queen side. C5, maybe B5, A5, get the bishop to E6, and start hovering around the white king would be at least slightly problematic for white. Magnus decides to, well, get his own attack started and going. He plays G4, which is a very nice break. Probably not the best move in this position, but very nice break from Magnus. Another plan would be to play slightly more slowly with maybe Rook E1 and F3. But Magnus's plan with G4 is very nice, and I like it a lot. But Alireza really took this well and showed a great understanding in the next couple of moves. He took, of course, on G4 something like Knight F6 is not recommended for black. Here there are some problems with the G file open against the king, and of course the trick F3 hitting the bishop on F5 at the end is also slightly problematic for black at some point. Maybe not immediately, but at least it's a trick to remember. F takes G4 played in the game. Magnus took on E4, of course, with his knight, and he chose to do that with the knight on D2, which was the more passive knight of the two. So that's logical as well. Knight B6 from Alireza, preparing to finish his development with Bishop E6, maybe even Bishop F5 to pin the knight on E4. Looks very strong if you get that in one move. So Magnus decides to stop this. Knight G3, Bishop E6 as planned, King B1, tucking the king away in the corner, Rook F8, and now E4 from Magnus. This might look like a very powerful center, two nice central pawns supported by two knights, but black has several squares available for his pieces, and as we can see, the pawn on f2 is slightly backward and potentially weak, which is a problem for white. And in this position as well, these two central pawns, they are not very strong, they are slightly weak, as especially the d4 pawn might get under attack from queen and rook from black. So this position is not the most pleasant for Magnus, but he fights on. Rook a8, and now Magnus brings his rook into the game. Queen f6, hitting the pawn on f2. Magnus decides to do something quite drastic here, because there are two pawns hanging. He decides to go for f4. And now g takes, en passant, queen f2. Protecting the pawn on d4 and trying to pile up the pressure on this f3 pawn, or even play in the g file and use this pawn as a sort of shield from the black pieces. Of course, this is not good for white, but at least it's fun. But Alireza must have been quite confident in his own chances here, I believe. Knight c4, rook g1, as mentioned, queen h4. And around this point, Alireza has a very big advantage, and in a classical game he would have put heavy pressure on Magnus and tried to win the game. In this tiebreaker, where black had slightly less time than white, and there's only 1 second increment. Remember that, guys, only 1 second increment. So you can't really make a couple of fast moves and build up some time on the clock. There's no opportunity to do that, as there's no 2 second, 3 second, 5 second increment in this game. So Alireza needs to be pretty quick, and as we can see, both players are down to about 3 minutes at this point. King h8, again some patient move from Magnus, and now e5, trying to get his knight into the game. Bishop d5, and now suddenly rook f3. So Alireza allows Magnus to recapture the pawn, but Alireza sees that, okay, the end game that we get here is pretty equal. And I guess the players would have agreed to a draw if this was a classical game, but Magnus, slightly low on time, wants to, of course, play this one out and pressurize Alireza. Alireza, of course, only needs a draw, but Magnus has a pass pawn, supported by the pawn on d4, which gives him some chances, at least in practical terms. King g8. King f8, and to go to e7 and maybe to the queen side could have been also a maneuver, but Alireza chose king f7, slightly more active, maybe even go to d5 with the king. King b4, and now h5, just trying to stop Magnus from playing the slightly cramping move h5. He does it himself, Alireza. a4, king e6, and now a5. Very nicely done by Magnus, bringing his pawn into the game, and of course trying to stop these pawns from moving, thus decreasing black's mobility on the queen side. Rook g3 from Alireza, planning rook g4, of course, trying to win the pawn on h4. Magnus would not be able to exchange rooks in that scenario, so he would have to move away and lose a pawn. a6. b6, not allowing his pawn structure to get cramped here, Alireza, which could have been problematic. He instead plays b6, king c4, rook g4, and king d3. Of course, if they exchange rooks here, then suddenly we have a pawn endgame, king and pawn endgame, and this is, well, quite well known to be at least a bit risky to do, unless you're completely sure about the outcome when you have rooks on the board. So practical tip from me, guys, don't exchange down to a king and pawn endgame if you can have a pretty solid and safe rook endgame. Rook endgames are always drawn, as we say. They are quite tricky to win, and if you have a rook on the board, always chances to become active. If you exchange this one off, you would have to do some tremendous calculation to be able to figure many pawn and king endgames out, at least before exchanging, of course. Alireza chose the solid move rook g3, rook e3, and rook g4. Magnus, in no position to accept the draw, plays rook f3, c5, takes, rook f8, king takes e5, rook f7, and you might wonder why the game concluded here. I mean, what happened? Did they agree to a draw? The computer shows the very nice line c4 and some maneuver like this, for example, could have been on the board. Would have probably ended in a draw this as well, but instead, after rook f7, Alireza knocked the piece over, was not able to pick it up in time and make his move, and lost on time actually. So Magnus wins the tiebreak against Alireza Firouzja, thus gets 1.5 points from his encounter with Alireza, while Alireza, after having pretty decent chances in this tiebreaker, is left with only the draw from the classical game.